Receiving an Alzheimer's or dementia diagnosis impacts patients, of course, but it also affects their loved ones, and it affects their caregivers, it affects their communities. Joining me now is Aisha Adkins, constituency organizer for a nonprofit Caring Across Generations. Aisha became a caregiver after her mom was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia before the age of 60. Aisha, thank you so much for joining us. And I really feel strongly that we get stories of lived experience into our discussions of bureaucracy, the FDA, funding levels, that we remember real people are involved. I'd love to hear, as you think about caring across generations, and I've always thought there's a strength in intergenerationality, if you will. Not a lot of people get it. You do get it. But tell us what you're approaching. Tell us what inspired you, your mom's story, and how's it going?
Well, certainly. Thank you so much for having me, Steve, and for including the caregiver experience. So my mother was diagnosed with frontotemporal dementia in 2013. She was only 57 years of age. And the diagnostic process was a challenging one. It took around 2 years to get a proper diagnosis, and that was following several misdiagnoses, initially starting with simply menopause-related stress. And so certainly my initial exposure to the diagnostic system, as you alluded to in the last segment, kind of issues around trust within communities of color and the healthcare system, making sure that we are believed when we present with symptoms, was certainly something that inspired me to advocate on behalf of my mother and her lived experience, and also what my father and I observed as the symptoms that were very concerning, changes in behavior and mood that were very uncharacteristic of her. And this journey has certainly made me passionate about advocating not only for those living with dementia, but for those of us who are providing care. I've been caring full time for my mother since she was diagnosed, and it's certainly been a challenging journey, making sure that I get access to the services that I need, like home and community-based services, long-term care, and also making sure that my mother gets the equitable care that she deserves.
I remember, I guess it was, I know this is an odd way of thinking about it, 2 presidential races ago, we were doing events, and we had the Alzheimer's Association working with us, so we had a lot of political candidates and everything, and we brought someone who was actually living with Alzheimer's into the conversation. One of the most impactful conversations I've ever had, because this was a person who was trying to find their way and trying to share what they were feeling and going through. And what I'll never forget is this gentleman shared how important it was to him to finally find someone who could help him navigate through this kind of what you just described. How do you do that? I mean, this is so unfair, but how do you do that in a way that's more systemized, available, easy to get, and predictable? Because that's what people are in the very front end of this, is lonely, frustrating, and filled with anxiety. And so I guess the question is, how do we make that an easier, less stressful, predictable process? Sorry to be long-winded on it, but I think it's so important what you do.
Most certainly. Well, I think there are a number of ways that we can approach this. Certainly making sure that we fund the systems that are already in place, where there are social workers and the providers and other really relevant parties who are assisting and who are there to assist you through this process. But it's also removing some of that red tape that creates barriers. But in addition to that, making sure that underserved communities have the access that they need, making sure that there is education around the disease, and making sure that folks have access to ongoing primary care and specialists care. Oftentimes these diseases are diagnosed by a neuropsychiatrist, but those can be very difficult to come by, also very expensive, particularly for the uninsured. So making sure that those needs are met, and making sure that we kind of remove some of the ambiguous process of applying for local services, and then also, of course, expanding Medicaid so that once a diagnosis is received, that there are things you can put in place to make the process a little bit easier. Certainly, it won't be easy, but perhaps with a bit of help, it can kind of cushion the blow.
Aisha, one of the things is, and I'm going to get the frame is, you said that your mom got diagnosed around 57 years of old. That to many people by any standards young, but you talk about millennial caregivers, and I'm just wondering, are there missing things that we're not doing when it comes to building literacy among millennials? So it's not just a reactive thing. Oh, my family member has this, so I have it, but building greater awareness among a next generation of people that this is a collective responsibility, a shared responsibility, a social responsibility and priority. I know that may not be easy, but it just sort of seems to me to be potentially missing right now.
Certainly. Well, I agree. That is certainly a missing component of a lot of discussions. I think, unfortunately, within Western society, there's a tendency to silo based on generation, whereas in many cultures, you have intergenerational households, everyone living under the same roof, bearing witness to one another's experiences. Whereas, in the United States in particular, what we see is there's this standard or this criteria for success in adulthood, and that is leaving the home at 18 or 21. And so there becomes this disconnect. And in order to really create empathy, which is where I believe that change begins, you need to be in each other's presence. And I think one silver lining with the pandemic is that many people did find themselves in those intergenerational households once again. And it allowed people to really see changes in their parents or their grandparents or aunts and uncles, whatever that relationship happens to be, and to take note and to say, gosh, I think there might be something wrong here. So it really gave the opportunity for earlier intervention, but making sure that wherever the living situations are, that those relationships are strengthened is certainly going to be key. But also another component of that is culture change and changing the way that we view aging, really rebranding aging, right? And ridding our culture of the tropes and the stereotypes associated with getting older. I really recall growing up, and my associations with aging came from really children's television. There was always the older adult who was forgetful, and that forgetfulness was often the punchline. And that's very problematic because, once again, we are poking fun at a very serious, very fatal disease.
One of the things I'm reading here is this profile of you in the Washington Post that ran in December. It's really powerful about your mom, and basically outlined, that when she got her diagnosis, it came too late for her to outline her own care preferences. I mean, it just sort of brings to life, the burden that you have. And it also talks about Black and Latina women, which we were just raising, a minute ago with the previous speaker. What is your sense? I mean, I guess what would help? What would be the elements of helping? I read this and I read, COVID has hit, the availability of support. But I'd like to know for you, if we had you in Washington with a bunch of senators and congressmen, members of the administration, and you had 10 minutes with them, what would you say? Look, you have to fix this because this is what's happening in the real world.
Most certainly. So, very simply put, I would ask them to fund and to support Build Back Better and to make a full investment in home and community-based services. Caring for someone who is living with dementia is financially, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually exhausting, physically exhausting. And it's not necessarily because we don't want to provide care for our loved ones, but it is very challenging, particularly as the disease progresses and people begin to lose their daily functions and can no longer carry out their activities of daily living, bathing themselves, dressing themselves, and making other major decisions for themselves. And so by making sure that we fund the home care workers, making sure that they can make living wages so that when they come into our homes, they are well supported, that they have access to health insurance, and making sure that they are well trained, and so that there is a mutually beneficial relationship there, and making sure that things like adult day programs and other community resources are really robust. Those are the sorts of investments that are truly life changing. Additionally, things like paid leave. I know that I was very concerned as I searched for a job. I graduated from college in 2009, and we were still really reeling from the effects of the Great Recession. And one of my biggest challenges in my job search once I became my mother's caregiver was whether or not to disclose my status as a caregiver, understanding that there were already barriers and biases that I had to face going into the job market as a Black woman. And now I have this label of caregiver where I have these care responsibilities, and there's already that pay inequity as a woman. So there are many, many different layers and components, and there are also a lot of solutions that we can address as a nation, as the only nation in the world that does not have paid leave. And so the only developed nation in the world that does not have paid leave. So there are definitely solutions that are available. It's a matter of making sure that our elected officials come together, because this is not a partisan issue. Dementia does not care what side of the aisle you reside on.
Right.
It can and will affect your family. So making sure that we have consensus on that, and
Right.
and that we move swiftly, and that we move with enthusiasm toward
Right.
providing these solutions, and also making sure that we rid the health, social determinants of health that have also been spoken about today, making sure that we do all that we can to address the systemic oppression, and making sure that we don't prolong racial and the trauma of racial and social violence against women, violence against Black and brown bodies. These are all things that are somewhat seemingly unrelated, but that really have an impact on the care experience from a Black and brown perspective.
Right. Well, Aisha Adkins, you're welcome back anytime. This is an incredibly great, I'm very, very grateful for you to come in and share your mother's experience, your experience, and your work with Caring Across Generations. Really appreciate your thoughts and candor today.
Certainly, Steve. Thank you so much for having me.